Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. We're happy to welcome you to today's stakeholder briefing on findings from the midline evaluation of the Preserve Resilience Food Security activity implemented by Food for the Hungry in Ethiopia. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as Activity Director for the IMPEL Associate Award. The overall purpose of IMPEL is to conduct both performance and impact evaluations to facilitate knowledge sharing and to improve design and implementation of BHA-funded resilience food security activities, or RFSAs. And I'll ask Terry to paste a link in the chat box to a 2-page brief that provides a bit more detailed information on our activities. Today's presentation will be led by Causal Design, who's among IMPEL's 5 research partners. Most will know that Causal Design has extensive experience in designing and conducting rigorous research on food and livelihood security programming throughout sub-Saharan Africa, including previous research for BHA. Today's presentation will be led by Enrico Campos of the Causal Design team, and he may be joined by others on the Causal Design team as needed to help respond to questions about the PReSERVE midline evaluation. In addition to sharing selected findings about the study, Causal Design will give an overview of the midline evaluation methodology and its overall purpose within the PReSERVE impact evaluation design. They'll also respond to any questions you may have about the findings, but for those of you who have questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function to enter your question so that we can efficiently answer as many as possible. Finally, today's presentation and Q&A will be recorded, but only for IMPEL and BHA reference, and the recording will not be shared publicly. So with that, we thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it off to Enrico to get us started. Over to you, Enrico.
Great. Many thanks, Tom. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Given that we have just an hour for this call, I'll just go ahead and get started. Next slide, please, Terry. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, so the purpose of today's workshop is twofold. First, this is an opportunity for Causal Design to present the midline evaluation findings and some of the contextual factors that underlie many of these results. These were surfaced during a workshop that we held with FH, which is the main IP, during early November. The second is that we hope that the presentation and discussion of these findings will provide you all with a better understanding of, what's sort of going on and to better inform future programming. All right, next slide, please. Just a brief refresher for everyone here. So the PReSERVE RFSA aims to improve the food security of vulnerable households and target PSMP communities in Ethiopia's Amhara region, with the goal of contributing to a sustained reduction in rural poverty. To assess the impacts of the PReSERVE program, the evaluation compares outcomes between 2 different household groups. We have treatment group households, which received the non-core PSMP LD interventions, and then the control group households, which did not receive these non-core PSMP LD interventions. So next slide, please. So as you can see here on this slide, this is just an overview of the general intervention packages from the PReSERVE activities. As you can see here, treatment and control group households received the non-LD interventions and the core PSMP LD interventions. The primary difference between treatment and control group households is with the non-core PSMP LD interventions. To clarify, only treatment group households received these interventions, so this impact evaluation rate aims to estimate the marginal impacts of these specific interventions. Next slide, please. All right, so then this impact evaluation employs a stratified randomized control trial design. So the household group of interest here are the households that are eligible to receive the LD interventions. So this was determined using proxy means testing, where the poorest 20% of the households are part of the grants track, and therefore they weren't eligible to receive the LD interventions. So these households are not examined as part of this impact evaluation. This leaves us with the remaining 80% of households that are eligible to receive the LD interventions. Now, if we look at this particular subset of eligible households, right, they were split further into different strata defined by
Enrico, we lost you for a
scores.
second. Oh, you're back.
Oh, yep.
You're back.
Sorry, I guess I can. Where did you lose me, Terry?
I'm not sure what you were. I'm sorry.
Oh, where did you lose me?
I just a couple seconds before I cut
Okay.
in. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'll go back there. So from this set of eligible households, right, they were split into different strata using, they were defined by Cabela and capability scores. And then within each Cabela, right, the top 60% of households with the highest capability scores are not part of the IE study because they automatically qualify to receive the LD interventions. So then this finally leaves us with the bottom 40% of households. This bottom 40% represents the households that were examined for this impact evaluation. During baseline, a total of 4,235 households were interviewed, out of which 3,468 households were part of the bottom 40%. 1,732 control and 1,736 treatment households across 55 Cabelas in the Amhara region. Next slide, please. So just looking at the big picture, the midline survey is just part of the 4 main activities that are carried out as part of this IE. So we started with the baseline survey in 2022. This was followed by a process evaluation in 2023, which assessed program implementation and contextual relevance. Then, this year we ran the midline assessment, right, which was conducted 2 years after the baseline survey, and is effectively a smaller and abbreviated analysis of a version of the baseline analysis. And then, in sometime in 2025 or 2026 will be the last phase of the study, which is the endline. During endline, we will collect survey data from the same communities and households surveyed during baseline to estimate the ability of the LD interventions to impact household food security and other measures of well-being as defined by DHA standard indicators. Right, next slide, please. Right. Now, to clarify, the household sample at midline consists of a smaller subsample of the households that were surveyed during baseline. For the midline sample, we aim to survey approximately a third of the baseline sample of the households, which gave us the number of 1,339 households that we surveyed at midline. Turning to the outcomes that we examined, the midline did not look at the full set of outcomes that were collected during baseline. During midline, we did not collect data on household expenditures, agriculture yields, anthropometric measures, and modern family planning. These outcomes were excluded because changes in these outcomes were not expected to have manifested over the 2-year period between baseline and midline. The decisions to exclude these outcomes was done in consultation between BHA, Causal Design, and FH. Next slide, please. Great. This takes us to the meat of today's presentation, which is the overview of the midline results. Next slide, please. Before we dive into the results, there are a few points to keep in mind when looking at the numbers that we present. First, while differences in average values between treatment and control can be informative, they aren't necessarily evidence to demonstrate impact. So what we do is we test whether these differences between the treatment and control groups are statistically significant. Second is that for a lot of these outcomes, we deal with the percent of households or the percent of individuals. For these outcomes, the treatment effects that we present should be interpreted as a percentage point change and not a percent change. So if you look at the slide, the example here, right, if we compare the means between treatment and control, right, and we see that the mean is 12% and the control mean is 10%, right, the correct interpretation for this treatment effect would be a 2 percentage point increase, not the 20% increase. Third, to the third point, right, this impact evaluation, it measures the impact of the non-core LD intervention package as a whole. Evaluating the effects of specific interventions is something that cannot be done with this sort of method, with the current methodology. This would require a much greater sample size which would also increase the costs required to run this evaluation. However, to go deeper, we did run a contextualization workshop earlier or back in November, and then with a qualitative exercise, right, to kind of dig deeper into some of the more granular details regarding the specific interventions themselves. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. Okay. Lastly, we can say, from the results, right, whether a change is statistically significant and therefore a result of program activities, but we cannot say whether or not this is a good outcome or a meaningful outcome based on, sort of the efforts or your money spent. So, all right, next slide, please. Now, based on our discussions with FH, there were two general themes that surfaced when contextualizing the midline results. First is that the conflict and insecurity in the Amhara region is the main factor that has limited FH's capacity to roll out a lot of their activities. And you'll see that present throughout the midline results. To a lesser extent, drought also affected programming. This is particularly relevant for a lot of the interventions that target food insecurity, where the drought exacerbated disruptions in food markets, making it difficult for households to regularly access food. Okay. All right, I'll stop here just for a few seconds here, and I'll table. Are there any questions from the group just regarding this overview of the evaluation design and methodology and sampling? Okay, if there aren't any, I'll go ahead and dive straight into the first set of outcome domains. Next slide, please, Terry. Next slide, please. Here, this is just an overview of the key findings across the food security and agriculture outcome domains. I will just, this is just an overview here, but I'll dive deeper into the results. So next slide, please. All right, for food security, the first outcome that we examined was the household perception of food insecurity. This was measured using the FIES score, which is an indicator that takes on values from 0 to 8 based on whether households indicate yes to a series of 8 questions that assess the household's perception of food insecurity. This score is then used to determine the thresholds of moderate or severe levels of food insecurity, where scores that are greater than 4 and less than 7 constitute moderate food insecurity, and scores of 7 or 8 constitute severe food insecurity. Overall, what we observe is that there are no statistically significant differences between treatment and control for the FIES scores and in the prevalence rates of moderate and severe food insecurity. Next slide, please. Okay, the second outcome that we examined was household food consumption. The food consumption of the household was assessed using the FCS score. This is an indicator that takes on values between 0 and 112 based on whether households consumed food from 10 different food groups over the course of 1 week. Each of the 10 food groups is assigned a weight, and then the score is then used to define 3 consumption thresholds. 4 consumption thresholds consist of FCS scores under 22. Scores that are between 22 and 35 are considered borderline, and scores above 35 are acceptable. At midline, what we see is a shift in the distribution of the food consumption profiles of treatment households. The pattern observed in midline suggests a trend away from borderline and towards acceptable food consumption. From the graphs here, we can see that treatment group households are about 6 percentage points less likely to be on the borderline and 6 percentage points more likely to have acceptable food consumption scores at midline. Next slide, please. Overall, for the food security outcomes, we observed 2 things. We see that treatment and control group households don't differ with respect to their perceptions of food insecurity. And we observe small changes in household food consumption that are occurring among households that maybe had better food consumption to begin with during baseline. The limited results that we are observing could in large part be due to the conflict in the Amhara region. The conflict in the region has limited the capacity of the IEP to roll out the interventions that target household food insecurity. Furthermore, the conflicts have disrupted food markets on the supply and demand side, so this makes it difficult for food to get to households in the first place. So this could explain why we see pretty small changes during the are there any questions around food security?
Yes, Enrico. Taka has
Yes.
entered one, and I see that Rigsum is entering their response. I'll just read it out for the rest of the group. He asks, overall, is there a difference between the baseline and midline despite no difference between treatment and control, since both groups are getting some consumption smoothing support?
I think that, and for this evaluation design, right? The evaluation design doesn't consist of the comparison between midline and baseline values. There's a lot of sort of factors there. When you do these type of before and after comparisons, it makes it a little bit, it's heavily subject to different biases arising from differences in context and other characteristic differences between the households. So that makes it a bit difficult to do, which is why we looked at, the differences in the state of consumption for these households, during the midline phase specifically, instead of comparing them between baseline and midline. But I think Rigsum also, my colleague Rigsum, I think is also typing sort of a response and an answer to that as well. I would also say that this was a comment that was a very common comment that was surfaced across across for the first I guess in the comments in the first draft of the report, but I think that we responded to those comments there when we sent the second draft of the report. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that as well. So thanks. All right, next slide, please, Terry. Thanks. So for agriculture, the first outcome we examined is looking at the prevalence of farmers who practiced or received services from 11 specific activities promoted by the PReSERVE activity over the past 12 months. This outcome indicator looks at farmers who cultivate crops or raise livestock for the purposes of earning income. Overall, if we look at the BL30 indicator, there aren't any statistically significant differences between treatment and control group farmers in terms of the practice of the promoted value chain activities. If we look at the individual activities, the most prevalent ones are the purchasing of inputs for crops, purchasing inputs for livestock, and the use of improved storage for crops. At the activity level, although we don't observe any statistically significant, we do not observe statistically significant differences between treatment and control groups for most activities. The most prominent exception is the purchase of inputs for livestock. We see here that treatment group farmers are almost 10 percentage points more likely to do this activity than their control group counterparts. Beyond these three activities, the prevalence is low for the remaining set of activities. The IEP indicated that there were significant delays in rolling out the value chain activities on account of the conflict in the region. Due to these delays, the IEP focused on promoting the uptake of the production side value chain activities. This could certainly be a factor that explains why we see the higher uptake for the purchasing input activities compared to the other value chain activities. Next slide, please. Great. So the next outcome that we examine is the prevalence of farmers using at least one NRM practice. We find that the prevalence of farmers that use at least one practice is high. It's over 3/4 of farmers that report using at least one NRM practice. And we do observe a statistically significant difference between treatment and control group farmers, where farmers in the treatment group are about 5 percentage points more likely to utilize at least one NRM practice than their control group counterparts. If we examine the individual practices, we find that the most prominent practices are FMNR, delimitation of pasture areas, and rotational grazing. For the remaining activities, we find that the prevalence among farmers is low. Next slide, please. The next set of outcomes that we examine involve the use of improved practices among farmers who grew haricot beans and potatoes. If we look at the overarching trends for haricot beans, we see that about 8% of farmers across treatment and control groups grew haricot beans during the midline. Although there are no differences between treatment and control for the BL21 indicator, the use of improved practices is pretty high, covering almost all farmers across treatment and control groups. Next slide, please. If we examine just the cultivation practices, we see that there is an improvement among treatment group farmers. Here we see that treatment group farmers are about 9 percentage points more likely to use at least one cultivation practice than control group farmers. If we dive deeper into the individual practices, we observe large and statistically significant treatment effects for the following practices. We see that treatment group farmers are 19 percentage points more likely to practice crop rotation and 17 percentage points more likely to utilize improved seeds. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at potatoes, we can see that there's a much greater percentage of farmers that grew potatoes during the midline, close to 40% of farmers across the treatment and control groups. However, there are no statistically significant differences between the two groups. Overall, if we look at the BL21 indicator, we see results that are similar to the case of haricot beans. We can see that although there are no differences between treatment and control groups, the prevalence of farmers using improved practices is pretty high, covering almost all potato farmers at midline. Next slide, please. All right, thank you. Now for the midline, there were 4 livestock of interest: goats, oxen, cows, and sheep. Now, if we look at goats, we see that there are a greater percentage of farmers in the treatment group that raised goats at midline. Farmers from the treatment group were about 5 percentage points more likely to raise goats than their control group counterparts. If we look at the BL21 indicator, there aren't any differences between treatment and control groups. However, the prevalence of the adoption of at least one improved practice is pretty high among treatment and control group farmers, covering nearly all farmers that raised goats at midline. Sorry, oxen at midline. Or, goats, sorry. Next slide, please. Turning to oxen, we see that about 40% of farmers raised oxen during the midline. If we look at the BL21 indicator, again, we don't see any differences between treatment and control groups. However, the prevalence of the adoption of at least one improved practice is high across both groups, covering almost all farmers that raised oxen during midline. Next slide, please. For cows, we see that about 30% of farmers raised cows during the midline across both treatment and control groups. If we look at the BL21 indicator, there aren't any differences between the two groups. However, again, the adoption rates of using at least one practice is pretty high across both groups, covering almost all farmers that raised cows during midline. Next slide, please. All right. If we look at sheep, we see that there was a greater percentage of farmers that raised sheep, where treatment group farmers were about 7 percentage points more likely to raise sheep during the midline than farmers in the control group. If we look at the BL21 indicator, we don't see any differences between treatment and control groups. However, the prevalence of the use of at least one improved practice is high across both groups, covering almost all farmers that raised sheep during midline. Next slide, please. Now, just to recap the findings for livestock, what we see is that we see no statistically significant differences between treatment and control in terms of raising oxen and cows. We do observe statistically significant differences for goats and sheep, where treatment group farmers are more likely to raise goats and sheep than their control group counterparts. I think this just reflects PReSERVE's programming, which actively targeted and promoted farmers to raise cows and sheep. In terms of the adoption of improved livestock raising practices, although we don't observe any statistically significant differences in terms of the percentage of farmers that utilize at least one of these practices, the overall prevalence rates are high across treatment and control groups, covering almost 90% of farmers that raised each of these livestock. Now, if we dig into the individual raising practices, we can see that there are statistically significant differences for cows and sheep. Treatment group farmers are less likely to practice castration when raising.
Nico, we lost you for a second.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you were just talking about castration and cows.
And cows, got it. So in short, essentially, in terms of the individual practices, we observe differences, right, for cows and sheep only. We don't see them for the rest of the livestock. That just reflects, I think, PReSERVE's programming, which actively targeted the promotion of these practices specifically for cows and sheep. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, to close out the agriculture set of outcomes, the last outcome that we examined was the use of financial services by farmers. This is gauged by whether farmers have utilized either one of the following services over the past 12 months: savings, agricultural credit, and agricultural insurance. At Midline, we observe a large and statistically significant treatment effect, where we see that treatment group farmers are 19 percentage points more likely to use financial services than control group farmers. This is driven by the agricultural credit and savings components, whose uptake was actively promoted by the LV interventions. All right. Any questions regarding agriculture? I see a question from Andy. Is the difference between large and small animals reflect any differences due to the gender of the individual responsible? I would say likely not. I would likely not. When we look, I think that it's a bit tricky to look at the differences across the genders, just because for the agriculture modules, the questions were posed to the lead farmer. And so that kind of makes our sample size a bit smaller and can make it a bit difficult to disaggregate by gender. But that's something that would be interesting to look at. Next slide, please. All right, next slide. This is just an overview of the results for the main things that we're observing for child nutrition and women's health. I'll be diving more deeply into these in a second here. So next slide, please. All right, for child health, we looked at two outcomes: the prevalence rates of diarrhea among children under 5 years of age, and the prevalence of treatment via oral rehydration therapy amongst these children that had diarrhea. We can see that there are no differences in the prevalence rates of diarrhea between children from treatment and control households. However, the prevalence rates of diarrhea remain high across both groups. When we look at treatment via ORT, we see that although there are no statistically significant differences between treatment and control, we do see a fairly large decrease in the prevalence of ORT to treat diarrhea for the treatment group. Although, one thing to note here is that this result or this observation should be treated as highly suggestive. I think low sample sizes, especially amongst the child outcomes, were something that was something that we were dealing with for both the baseline and the midline. So hopefully by the end line, where we'll be working with maybe a larger sample size, this should improve our ability to detect any significant effects. It is worth noting and just looking at more closely. All right, next slide, please. Okay, women's dietary outcome. So for women's health, the first outcome that we examined was the prevalence of diets of minimum diversity among women of reproductive age. The analysis shows two things. First is that there are no statistically significant differences in BMDD scores between treatment and control groups. And two is that the prevalence of GWRAs, meaning a diet of minimum diversity, is low across both groups. For the midline sample, roughly only 1% of women of reproductive age across both groups consumed a diet that met minimum diversity. Next slide, please.
I think we lost you again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we haven't heard anything on this slide though. It was right when I switched
Okay.
that we lost you.
Okay, perfect. Okay. All right. So in terms of if we look at the consumption across food groups, we can see here that the percentages for the consumption of grains and roots and pulses are pretty high. After that, the percentages fall quickly, below 10% for the remaining food groups. As you can see here, and then on the next slide, please, Terry. All right, next slide, please. Now, the second domain of women's health outcomes that we examined was maternal care. Here, the indicator of interest is the percent of births that received at least 4 antenatal care visits during pregnancy. Note this covers pregnancies that led to live births over a 5-year period. Overall, at midline, across both treatment and control groups, close to 50% of the births in the PReSERVE implementation area received at least 4 ANC visits. However, there are no statistically significant differences between treatment and control group households. I'll stop here for a second. If there are any questions from the group regarding the child health and women's health outcomes. Great. Yeah. All right. Next slide, please, Karen. All right. This takes us to the next outcome domain that we looked at, which is gender dynamics. Next slide, please, Terry. And then next slide, please. All right. Now, for the first outcome that we looked at in terms of gender dynamics was cash. I was looking at cash earning between men and women. For the percentage of cash earners, we have 2 main findings. First, we can see that the proportion of cash earners is higher for married women than married men. And the second thing that we see here is we observe greater treatment effects for women than men. If we look at married individuals altogether, we see that married individuals from the treatment group are about 12 percentage points more likely to be cash earners. We just look at men from the treatment group are about 7 percentage points more likely to be cash earners. And if we look at married women, treatment group married women are about 20 percentage points more likely to be cash earners. I think that these 2 findings taken together reflect the programming of PReSERVE's LD interventions, which prioritize the targeting of women over men. Next slide, please. Taking a look at the decision-making dynamics between men and women, we observe differences for women only, although the reason we may not observe statistically significant differences for all indicators could be due to the fact that the sample sizes are on the lower end for these indicators. Treatment and control households differ with respect to the participation of women in the use of cash, both the cash that they earned themselves and the cash that was earned by their spouse. We can see that married women in the treatment group are about 7 percentage points more likely to participate in the decisions around the use of their self-earned cash. Now, when it comes to the cash that is earned by the spouse, we see a much larger difference, where we see that married women from the treatment group are about 17 percentage points more likely to participate in decisions when it comes to the use of the cash that was earned by their spouse. While these results are encouraging, the sample sizes are still relatively small, so treat these observations as indicative. However, the increased participation of women in decisions around the use of cash could indicate some degree of internalizing the messages of many of the LD interventions by households. Many of these activities focus on training and emphasizing the importance of joint decision-making in the household. This is particularly evident for the BL34 indicator, where we see a large increase in women's participation around the use of their spouse's cash. Next slide, please. Turning to the second domain of outcomes, we can see that credit access increases greatly among married men and women in the treatment group. The increases in the proportion with credit access are similar between married men and women. Treatment group married men.
Enrico,
Yes.
okay. We lost you, but you were about to talk about married men.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, and apologies everyone, my internet's being a little bit finicky. But as you can see on the slides here, we can see that married men from the treatment group are about 22 percentage points more likely to access credit. And when we see a similar increase for married women, where we see that the probability of them accessing credit is about 26 percentage points higher. And then I think these large increases reflect the LD programming, which actively promoted the uptake of credit access programs. Next slide, please. Now, examining the borrowing or the decision-making dynamics when it comes to credit, we can see that the proportion of married individuals making borrowing decisions is greater for men than women. As we can see in the graphs, between 50 to 60% of men report making borrowing decisions, while only 40 to 44% of married women report making borrowing decisions. Secondly, we observe statistically significant differences among married men only. Married men from the treatment group are about 13 percentage points more likely to make participate in borrowing decisions than their control group counterparts. It's interesting here because we can see that for the borrowing decisions, we see that the results contrast the case of cash. Underlying gender dynamics may impact the women's role in decision-making. When we contextualized these results with FH, they had suggested that it was possible that women from the poorer households in the Amhara region could be less inclined to take on additional responsibilities associated with decision-making on credit. This is sort of something that we have followed up with FH on and hope to have more clarity in the final version of the report. All right, next slide, please. All right, Wash, next slide. Again, this is just an overview of the results. Oh, yep, and next slide, please, Terry. Thank you. Great. Now for Wash, the first set of outcomes that we examined was household access to basic drinking water services. If we examine the underlying criteria, we find that most households are able to access a water source that is available year-round, an improved water source, accessible within a 30-minute round trip from the home. The issue is that only a small percentage of households satisfy the last criterion, which is that the source should be able to provide 20 liters of water per capita each day. Next slide, please. The second outcome that we looked at was the prevalence of different water treatment practices among households. This indicator measures whether the household utilizes either one of the following practices to treat their water: adding bleach or chlorine, filtration, flocculation, solar disinfection, and boiling. At Midline, we observed two things. The prevalence of using water treatment practices is low across treatment and control groups, and there are no statistically significant differences in the percentage of households using these practices between both groups. And I think that the low uptake of water treatment practices is likely due to the fact that most households in this region can draw water from safe sources, meaning that water treatment is often not necessary. Next slide, please. The third wash outcome we examined is the presence of hand washing stations with soap and water on premises at households. At Midline, we observed that the prevalence of households with these type of hand washing stations differs between treatment and control groups, although the difference is small, where treatment group households are only 2 percentage points more likely to have these type of hand washing stations on the premises. The low prevalence and small changes observed in Midline likely reflect the fact that conflict limited the implementation of many of the market-based sanitation activities. This includes the activity that involves the building of these hand washing stations, meaning that even by midline, rollout had not covered a large proportion of households. Next slide, please. The next outcome that we looked at is the prevalence of open.
Enrico, we lost you again,
Okay.
and you're back.
Okay. Did I cut out at the slide here?
Yeah, just right when I switched.
Okay, perfect. So for open defecation, we see that the prevalence rates are still pretty high, between 45 to 52% across both groups during midline. We observe a statistically significant difference, though. We can see that treatment group households are about 6 percentage points less likely to practice open defecation than control group households. Again, I think that the continued sort of prevalence of open defecation could reflect the fact that, the implementation of many of the market-based sanitation activities by FH was delayed due to the conflict or hampered by the conflict. And these activities include the building of latrines or the toilet facilities for households to use. Next slide, please. To round out the wash outcomes, we look at the last set of outcomes we examine here are access to basic sanitation services. The criteria that constitute basic sanitation are first, that the households use toilets that flush to a piped sewer system, a septic tank, or a latrine. It's either that, or they use a pit latrine that is either ventilated or has a slab, or they use a composting toilet. So that's the first criterion. The second is that that the usage of these facilities is not shared among other households. At midline, we observe two things. We see that the percent of households with basic sanitation services access is low, covering only 10 to 11% of households at midline. And we don't observe any statistically significant differences between treatment and control groups with respect to this indicator. So again, I think the low household access and absence of differences could be due to the limited implementation of many of the market-based sanitation activities. Again, I think one of the primary activity that could be of interest here, right, is the building of the latrine or toilet facilities that are the core set of infrastructure that is, core to this BL27 indicator. All right. I will stop here for a second. Are there any questions from the group on wash outcomes? Okay, great. All right. Next slide, please, Terry. All right, next slide. All right, and then next slide, please. Okay. For resilience, the first outcome that we looked at was the household ability to recover from shocks and stresses. We measured these as an index, right? That comprises two sub-indices that reflect how households have perceived their recovery, the total number of shocks, and the severity of shocks experienced by the household over the past year. This index takes on values from 2 to 6. At midline, this index examined the household capacity to recover in response to 4 shocks in particular: food price of ag inputs, drought, and conflict. The overall results suggest that the LD interventions have not affected the household's ability to recover from adverse events during midline. We see this trend even when we compare treatment and control group households across the component sub-indices. Given that this indicator deals with household perceptions, it may be difficult to observe changes unless things improve a lot. Furthermore, the rollout of PReSERVE activities was significantly delayed due to conflict. This could be a factor explaining why substantive changes have yet to be observed. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, at midline, the local Government responsiveness indicator is a summary variable ranging from 0 to 1 based on whether there's a conflict resolution committee in the village. What we can see here at Midline is that there aren't any statistically significant differences between treatment and control groups at the Midline, and that we have about, I guess, and then the rates are about, and the scores are basically Terry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for a second, but you're back.
Okay, next slide, please. Perfect. Now, the household level social capital index assesses the ability of households to draw on social networks for support to reduce the impacts of shocks and stresses experienced by the household. Household level social capital is measured across 2 dimensions. We have the bonding social capital subindex, which measures the degree to which households are able to draw upon support from their social networks within their own communities. And then we have the bridging subindex, which measures the household's ability to draw upon their social networks from outside their own communities. At Midline, we see that the household level social capital is low, with no differences between treatment and control groups. This observation also applies if we look at the bonding and bridging subindices. Going back to the universal theme here, I think that the conflict and insecurity, in the region are the likely factors that are greatly diminishing the household's ability to access social support mechanisms. Next slide, please. Now to round out the resilience outcomes, the last thing that we look at is household participation in group savings, microfinance, and credit programs. What we see at Midline is that participation is low among control group households. And the second is that we observe a large increase in participation in these type of programs amongst the treatment group. We see that treatment group households are 21 percentage points more likely to participate in these programs. These are likely driven by a lot of the credit components, which were actively promoted by the PReSERVE LD interventions. Okay. Are there any questions regarding the resilience outcomes?
Yes, Enrico, there is one, another question posed by Andy Levin, to which Rigsum has responded. Again, I'll read this out loud just for the rest of the group. And it was, did you measure changes in productive or other assets, for example, livestock, as a basis for ability to respond to shocks?
Nope, and I see that my colleague Rigsum responded to that. So thank you very much, Rigsum, for that. And Andy, I hope that answers your question. Next slide, please, Terry. Great. Next slide. All right, then one more. All right, good. When we look at the participation in group-based programs, we see increases in the participation in village savings and loan programs in groups intended for mothers. Treatment group households are about 11 percentage points more likely to participate in village savings and loan programs, and 8 percentage points more likely to participate in groups intended for mothers. Next slide, please. When we look at livelihood-related interventions, we observe increases in treatment group participation for all these activities, with larger increases for employment, alternative livelihood, and agriculture trainings or meetings. Next slide, please. Pardon me. Turning to the last set of programs, we see statistically significant differences between the treatment and control groups when it comes to the participation in climate-related programs or activities. Here we see that treatment group households are 8 percentage points more likely to develop disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation plans, and 6 percentage points more likely to have information access on a variety of disaster or climate-related topics. All right. Next slide, please. All right. That takes us to the end of today's of the meat of today's sort of presentation. So I'll table, are there any burning questions from the group here regarding the results that we have presented today, or anything on the midline evaluation design, or sampling?
Thank you,
Any
Enrico. And please do feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A, or if you're brave enough, just come off mute, raise your hand, and pose them directly yourself.
Anyone? Can you guys still hear me? Just checking to make
We
sure I didn't
can
drop
still
out.
hear you, and I take it that that means that you did an excellent job covering all the bases, Enrico. Quite seriously, it was an excellent presentation. Appreciate those findings. Any other last-minute questions from participants today for Causal Design? Okay. If there's not now, we can give you a few minutes of your day back, but we do appreciate your participation in today's session. If any questions occur to you after today's session, please do let us know, either directly to IMPEL or with Causal Design, and we'll do our best to get you answers. I think as Causal Design is explained, some of those answers in more detail is included in the midline report. And I believe we will be able to share this final slide deck as well for any who are interested. Okay. If no other questions, oh, I see there may be one entered in the Q&A actually.
Let's take a look.
Yeah.
Any questions that we wish we had included? That's a good question there. I guess I think one of the things here, right? I guess it's one of these things that I discussed it earlier, right? In the evaluation methodology section or overview, right, is one of the main limitations of this study is that we can't look at the effects of individual interventions. That just requires, I think, a larger thing. But, you know, I think that if of course, if there were no budget constraints or anything like that, right, then that would, that's definitely something from my side that would be very interesting to look at. Or, we could look at maybe even like groups of interventions and comparing which ones are maybe have more effects than others. So that was definitely something that at least from my side, that would be interesting to have like explored further for this evaluation.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. Go ahead. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, sorry, Tom. And I think a major limitation of the midlines is that we didn't ask any questions on the child level outcomes because we just didn't have enough sample size at the midline because the midline is a subsample of our baseline and line samples. So we wish we could have also collected child level outcomes, but we couldn't, sadly.
Yeah, thank you. And I was just chiming in, following up on Andy's earlier questions, that if there's an opportunity at inline, there may be an interest in looking to any gendered aspects, particularly of livestock production and ownership decision making. So thanks for noting that, Andy and Rickson. Okay. I think we've answered all questions, or I think Causal Design has answered all questions for today. So again, we thank you very much for your participation today. Causal Design, thank you for an excellent debrief of the findings and the methodology and your response to these questions. Again, we will be sharing this final slide deck with all here today and all others invited to today's session. So thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time today. And thanks, Tom and Terry, for backstopping this.
No problem. Great job. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.